I'm Connor Old, and welcome back to another episode of Forgotten Oscar Films. And this week we are going to be looking at one of the most monumental, historic Oscar years of all time, the Harvey Weinstein Oscars, the 1998 Oscars, the year where Shakespeare in Love surprisingly beat out Saving Private Ryan. But while both those films will be remembered in Oscar history, today we're going to be covering one of the smaller movies that sometimes people forget about. But if you're new to the series, what I do every single week is talk about a movie that was nominated for Best Picture that I believe to be forgotten to time. A movie that isn't as well regarded, as rewatched, as isn't as talked about as some of the other movies, and try to figure out why this movie was considered one of the 5 best of the year, yet over the years has lost some of that cultural importance. Essentially, the show is broken down into 3 parts. The first part is giving some historical context, talk about the Oscars that year, which does tell us a lot about what was popular at the time, why a movie got nominated, and then also, why it ultimately doesn't resonate later on. So that first part's the historical context. Then, most of the times, I'm watching these movies for the very first time, so I want to give my thoughts on the movie because sometimes it's just that quality of the movie isn't as great as we maybe initially thought. And then the third part of the show is just trying to answer that age-old question as to why this movie was forgotten and not another one, and why it has sort of failed to stay in that cultural lexicon. So a little bit of background in case you're not as well versed on Oscar history. This 1998 Oscars, I think, is a really seminal year. There's been many pieces written about it because of the sort of controversy surrounding it, but also the surprise at the time, also the people involved, and really how it changed Oscar history as we know it. And I think for a lot of people, when you're going back and looking at the Best Picture winners, it still sort of strikes people to see that, oh, Saving Private Ryan, it was nominated and it lost out to Shakespeare in Love. Oh, that's a little bit weird. And in many ways, I think Shakespeare in Love is connected to, its reputation at least is connected to Saving Private Ryan because it's the movie that beat out Saving Private Ryan. In the same way, something like The King's Speech is connected to The Social Network because that's the movie that beat out the sort of more popular and critically acclaimed and well-regarded movie in The Social Network. But that's not its fault. I think Shakespeare in Love is a really delightful movie and a romantic movie, and quite good. Now, is it Saving Private Ryan? I don't think so, no. I mean, you're talking about arguably the greatest filmmaker of all time, making arguably his best film of all time, a historic American achievement, arguably the most iconic World War II movie. I mean, this was an important movie even at the time, huge hit. Oscar movie, I mean, it won 5 Oscars, including Spielberg winning his second best director Oscar. But what's so interesting about the years, because even though Saving Private Ryan, even at the time, but more so nowadays, has been sort of more well acclaimed as its own movie, Shakespeare in Love won in many parts because of the Weinstein Company and Harvey Weinstein and their approach to Oscar campaigning. Now, before this, there used to be maybe, some events that were held and, some money spent on for your consideration ads and things like this. But this year was sort of the first year that Harvey Weinstein, the Weinstein Corporation, which had done sort of great Oscar successes in Pulp Fiction and My Left Foot, and even this year, of course, Life is Beautiful, and later on we've covered movies like In the Bedroom and Chocolat. They were an independent studio that was able to really garner a lot of success and gain a lot of Oscar wins and nominations, more so than the studios, because in the past, the studios were always seen to be these big, corporations that had a lot of money that could spend more than the independent studios. But what, Harvey Weinstein and the company really did, particularly with this movie, was spend way more than any of the major studios. I mean, we're talking about 5 million versus 1 million or less. I mean, even smaller independent studios would spend maybe $250,000 or $500,000 on the campaigns, and in many ways doing sort of a guerrilla approach where it was very staid and true in the sense of many times the format was go onto a talk show. It was do some ads in print, but in this sort of version, Harvey Weinstein sort of introduced a lot of things. Before, it was just, go on a couple of late night talk shows. Now it's, Gwyneth Paltrow, Judi Dench, go to the parties and go to parties all the time. I mean, someone like Roberto Benigni, who won for Best Lead Actor for Life is Beautiful, moved to LA to actually go to campaigns and go to every party he was invited for, to become almost friends with the Academy and give them attention and increase that importance and give an emotional connection to the movie. He also was influential in the sense that he sent out, and that Weinstein Company sent out screeners. So nowadays they don't really do screeners anymore, but in the 2000s it was DVDs. And if you just send out, each Academy member would get the movie, the DVD, but in this case that wasn't as commonplace. As a matter of fact, it was VHS tapes. So a lot of Academy members could watch the movies at their homes. They would set up screening rooms for Academy members in many popular vacation spots, like Aspen or Hawaii, because they knew Academy members during Christmas would be vacationing there, so they would send their movie there. So it was just about getting people to watch the movie, getting people to love the movie, as well as doing some sort of more unsavory tactics of, whisper campaigns of saying, not only propping up your movie, but also degrading some of the other movies. Of course, in this case, Saving Private Ryan being sort of the main competitor, there was sort of print publications, and Harvey Weinstein would sort of spread the rumor of saying, oh, it's only in the first 15, 20 minutes, and the rest of the movie is pretty generic. Shakespeare in Love is different. It's more about the filmmaking process, and really sort of trying to shape and change the narrative like a political campaign would, and spending a lot of money to do that. I think a lot of people, when it happened, didn't realize the impact that could really have, and really shape the Oscars in the sense that more money now is being spent on Oscar campaigns. The Weinstein Corporation was really influential, all the way up until 2015, 2016 with The Imitation Game and Lion. They were still a strong powerhouse force right until the end of sort of the company's legacy. Of course, like I said, when looking back on it, it really does feel like a Harvey Weinstein Oscars, and has that sort of tinge of embarrassment in many ways because of how he was able to sort of take over Hollywood and almost buy the Oscars. And it doesn't have necessarily a good reputation because of that, particularly because of the man who Harvey Weinstein ended up being and revealed to be. And I want to stress how much of Saving Private Ryan was definitely the favorite. It won 5 Oscars. It won PGA. It won DJ. It won the Golden Globes. The kind of classic predictors, particularly at the time, of what's going to win the Oscar. And then still won, like I said, 5 Oscars, but then didn't win Best Picture. And then Gwyneth Paltrow kind of surprised, beating out Cate Blanchett here in Elizabeth. And Judi Dench won for Best Supporting Actress, despite only being in the movie for 8 minutes. This was definitely, this campaign definitely paid dividends. And I just want to put that into perspective, like how much of a surprise this was and how successful it actually was come Oscar night, because people didn't really believe it until, they actually sort of saw the results. But nonetheless, it is such an interesting Oscars because of how it really helped change and really introduce campaigning and serious campaigning in the way that it's never done before. And this is the movie I think most accurately and defiantly signifies that, because really this Shakespeare in Love win was a surprise. But the reason why I didn't cover those 2 movies was because Saving Private Ryan is still well regarded, and Shakespeare in Love is still a pretty good movie, and it is tied to Saving Private Ryan and its win more so than anything else. And of course, I mentioned Life is Beautiful, which also got nominated, which has the sort of historic moment of Roberto Benigni. Sort of, if you see in any Oscar montage, it's him sort of jumping over the chairs and walking on the heads of the chairs as he's going to win for Best Foreign Language Film. And then when he wins for Best Actor, he's sort of like running up and down the hallways. He really was sort of a thing at the time. Now, his career didn't go necessarily in the way that many people had hoped. And as a matter of fact, his next directorial debut was sort of quickly reviled, and he hasn't made that many movies since. But he was definitely a thing at the time, and once again, sort of that connection to Harvey Weinstein. So because of its sort of Oscar remembrance, and it still is a well-regarded movie on IMDb, and has, is still a good introductory sort of foreign film movie for a lot of people, that I think it'll still be well-regarded. And then the other Best Picture nominee that I didn't pick was The Thin Red Line, which was Terrence Malick's return to filmmaking 20 years later after Days of Heaven. Of course, he's gone on to make many more movies after this, but this was sort of his big comeback and return. Many people didn't think he'd return. Those movies were very well regarded, so when he came back, it was kind of like this big deal. But it still is surprising that it did get nominated, because it is a very artsy movie. It of course, is also a World War II movie, and Saving Private Ryan was also nominated. But that being said, it's still going to be well regarded because it's maybe Terrence Malick's best movie. It's really sort of the signifier of, oh, this is what late period Malick is going to look like in terms of his style. It is very different than a movie like Badlands or Days of Heaven. So because Malick is such a well regarded auteur and filmmaker and celebrated filmmaker, and this being maybe his best movie, I think it will still be well remembered. And then there's Elizabeth. is a movie that just doesn't have a necessarily big historical tie to it. Thin Red Line is connected to Terrence Malick, Spielberg with Saving Private Ryan, Shakespeare in Love with Harvey Weinstein in that sort of Oscar historical year, and then Life is Beautiful in a similar kind of a fashion. Elizabeth just doesn't have that, and what we've learned is that in order to be remembered, even something like Crash or The King's Speech are still well remembered because they're connected to the Oscars and in Oscar history. And Elizabeth is almost in the vein of something like Life is Beautiful, or even like a Chocolat, which was just didn't win any Oscars. Elizabeth did win one Oscar, but doesn't win a lot of Oscars. Kind of that fifth least likely to win Best Picture. Kind of a movie that is maybe a surprise at the time and is forgotten because it doesn't have, either for good or bad, a controversy or a particular item that can sort of viewers can latch onto and therefore last within historical context. But what about the movie itself? My thoughts on it is that it's well remembered for being Cate Blanchett's breakout role, and I think remembered correctly. At the time, Cate Blanchett had only done a couple movies, and this was really sort of her big leading star performance kind of a movie. It was a big hit. It's a well-written character. It shows sort of a seriousness that you don't see too often with younger actresses, and of course, it's gone on to give her great success. And it is remembered in the sense that it will be Cate Blanchett's sort of first Oscar nomination, but it's not a movie that is like, oh, she got robbed for the Oscar for this, because, Cate Blanchett has eventually won 2 Oscars. But I'm a huge Cate Blanchett fan, and I hadn't seen this movie, and I think this is really one of her best performances. I mean, she's an actress that, even if the movie's not good, she's great in it, and she's always doing great things. She was one of my favorite performances of the decade when I covered that series, and I talked about Carol, which was one of my favorite romantic movie of the decade, or one of them is her and Carol are right up there, but it's one of my favorite movies of the decade, so her performance was so integral to that. And of course, I can go on, something like Hela and Thor Ragnarok, going back, Notes on a Scandal, The Aviator, Blue Jasmine. She really is such a terrific actress, and this may be one of her best performances, which I think is saying a lot. And I think that's why when people watch the movie or suggest the movie, that should be the main pivotal sort of recommendation part of it, because it's a very interesting character in Elizabeth I. Daughter of Henry VIII, but was sort of maligned as a bastard child because his marriage with her mother, Anne, was annulled. And we talked a little bit about it last season of Forgotten Oscar Films when we talked about Anne of the Thousand Days, which is a similar sort of costume drama, and this movie is very much in debt to those 60s costume dramas. But an interesting character where she's sort of maligned, and then as a young woman becomes the queen, and then sort of her long reign throughout most of her life, not all her life, but sort of a good chunk of her life, in those early periods. And we see this sort of clear character arc where the character at the beginning is very different than the character at the end. But what Cate Blanchett's so able to do with a really well-written character is clearly define it from someone who was sort of loving and naive to sort of being hard and sacrificing her wants and needs for the greater good of England, and those desires and how they change throughout the movie and are almost sacrificed, and a little bit of sort of a melancholy and hopefulness to it, but also sort of like a seriousness that Cate brings. And to see, like I said, that's sort of 2 different characters. And when a movie or a script comes when the character clearly goes through a clear emotional arc, it's easy to say, okay, they start here, they end up here. It's easy to just say that and write it down on a piece of paper, but it's even harder for an actor to go, okay, well, I'm going to show you that arc, and I'm going to make it more of a progression in this sort of short 2-hour period as you believe it. So what's Cate so able to do so well in this movie is sort of show us these little glimpses of the past person throughout the movie. So when we're halfway through the movie, we're not going, oh, this is a different person. She would never do this. We do see the glimpses of the old self that we were introduced with. But then understand how these larger events have led her to believe and to make these sort of moves. And as she experiences more time with her advisors, and as the more time she becomes being queen, she sticks by her conscience and kind of how she guides her ruling, and how she's able to really understand the sort of position and take the reign of the throne and really embrace it in the same way where she was more naive, innocent, a little bit unsure of herself. Now becomes more of a strong leader, and that arc is so clearly portrayed and acted by Cate Blanchett. That's really the main selling point of the movie. Sometimes some of the cons is that the movie lacks a little bit of a visual identity. It does feel like many of the period pieces of the time, and very much in debt, like I said, to the 60s period pieces like A Man for All Seasons or Anne of the Thousand Days. So in terms of the visual excitement, it doesn't necessarily always have that, so it does feel sort of lumped into these other movies. And some people have their sort of classical period movie that they like. But I do find that the ones that do sort of last a longer period of time is like maybe the classics, Barry Lyndon. But really, I think the classics are in many ways feel more modern because of how they subvert the genre. That Barry Lyndon isn't just a strict kind of a costume drama. Same with Age of Innocence. Age of Innocence is, very much dealing with sex in the same way this movie doesn't, I think. Or a movie like Dangerous Liaisons or The Favorite are really kind of subversive in their approach to kind of thinking of this as a stodgy movie, but then kind of subverting that and showing how sort of modern it can feel. This movie does feel more in the line of the stodgy 60-year movies. But that being said, it's still an engaging story with a great sort of performance at the time. Sure, there's maybe some pacing problems. Sure, there's maybe that kind of visual language that makes it feel a little bit stodgy, that hurts it a bit. But at the end of the day, you're here for a great Cate Blanchett performance, and a great Cate Blanchett performance you do get. So, why was this movie forgotten? I think, as we mentioned in many episodes, the director is such an integral part as to why a movie is remembered. And this director, Shekhar Kapoor, his last movie was the sequel to this movie, Elizabeth the Golden Age, which was a critical and financial bomb. It was made in 2007, and he hasn't made a movie since. So he kind of was maybe put in director jail or kind of decided to do his own things. He's an Indian director, so he could always go back to sort of that side instead of, the bigger Hollywood movies. But he's sort of not a well-beloved auteur director. I also mentioned it sort of gets lost in the period movie shuffle. Even at this time, I think people will maybe even sort of lump it in with something like Shakespeare in Love and forget that, oh yeah, because they're both Elizabethan period dramas, some people will forget the difference between the two movies. And even at the time, maybe you were a big Elizabeth fan, but going back on it, it's not sort of seen as one of the classics, at least when I was sort of learning more about film. So it sort of slipped on my radar. And then you could even argue, because of how well Cate Blanchett has done, it's maybe not even a top 5 Cate Blanchett performance. So that makes it slip a little bit. And because it's not like the movie that she should have won for, because she won 2 Oscars already, it becomes sort of, once again, it's sort of a decrease in importance. But it is still important in terms of it's Cate Blanchett's biggest breakthrough movie, and it's just, unfortunately, out of the 5 nominees, I do think it is the most forgotten because it doesn't have that tie to an Oscar history. It doesn't tie to necessarily the Cate Blanchett. It doesn't have that sort of signature director. I mean, in terms of the modern day viewing of like how do people watch movies, things like search engine optimization and searching things on Netflix, well, that doesn't really help if your movie's called Elizabeth, because when I type Elizabeth in Google, you're not the first movie that shows up. So weird things like that ultimately do factor in it, but I do think it does have a sort of cult fan base, and it is a great Cate Blanchett performance. I think it will still last because of that. But that's about it, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video. Comment below, let me know maybe your top 5 Cate Blanchett performances. I'd love to hear that, and what your thoughts on this sort of historic Oscar year. There's some great pieces that I can link to in the comments below if you want to learn more about it. But that's about it, guys. Until next time, stay tuned.